Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Wednesday, November 19th. I'm Sarith Hawk, in for Elizabeth Arkalian. The Fresno Bee newspaper laid off 3 of its longtime editors earlier this month, and one of the results is that its opinion pages will now be managed from afar by editors at the Sacramento Bee.
The editorial page is very direct, whether through letters to the editor, op-eds, or other kinds of things. And when they cut that off, I thought it was really problematic for a local news site to tout being local without having local opinion and commentary.
A former editor of the Fresno Bee shares his concerns for the state of local media coming up later in the show. But first, these headlines. The race to redistrict just got more interesting. A judge in Texas has invalidated new congressional maps drawn by that state's legislature. The maps were intended to give Republicans an advantage in the House, and they triggered a gerrymandering race across the country, including here in California, where voters earlier this month approved new congressional maps by a massive margin. Political experts say the ruling in Texas will not affect California's maps. Meanwhile, Texas plans to appeal the ruling. The Valley's congressional delegation joined nearly all of the House of Representatives yesterday in voting to release the Epstein files. The House voted 427-1 to release the files about the convicted child sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Lawmakers hope the documents will reveal more information about who enabled Epstein's crimes. Republicans went along with the vote just a day after President Trump gave his blessing. Epstein died as he awaited trial in 2019. Environmental advocates held press conferences in the Central Valley and Central Coast yesterday. They were speaking out about new regulations issued by the California Department of Pesticides. The regulations require a further restriction of the fumigant known as 1,3-D. But Gabriela Facio with Sierra Club California says the use of the fumigant near schools and daycares is still alarming.
DPR has not only refused to ban 1,3-D, but has refused to follow the findings of the state's own cancer experts at the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment in setting the allowable exposure targets of its new regulations. And that is regulations plural, because DPR has created 2 regulations for this one fumigant with contradictory restrictions and targets.
1,3-D is used primarily to protect berries in the Central Coast and almond orchards in the Central Valley. The state's Department of Pesticide Regulation held public hearings on the new rules earlier this year. California's wolf population is continuing to grow. KVPR's Crescencio Rodriguez Delgado reports a new wolf pack has been confirmed in the Sierra Nevada.
Wildlife experts say the so-called grizzly pack has established its territory in Plumas County, that's north of Sacramento. The pack consists of 2 adults and 1 pup. Officials say this discovery means the state is still home to 10 wolf packs. Wolves have kept wildlife officials busy in recent years. Just 10 years ago, they found the state's first full wolf pack in nearly 100 years. And this fall, wildlife crews killed several wolves due to rising attacks on livestock. Those killings mainly took place in the Sierra Valley, an area near where this new pack was confirmed. Wolves are an endangered species in California, and their return is mostly due to individual dispersals from other states. For KVPR News, I'm Crescencio Rodriguez Delgado.
Recent wet weather set 3 new rainfall records in the valley. Daily rainfall totals in Hanford and Bakersfield topped records set on those days decades ago. One of the records had been on the books since 1930.
Support for Central Valley Daily comes from the members of KVPR. Join at $8 or more per month and access ad-free NPR podcasts through NPR Plus. Give now at kvpr.org/donate.
And now to our main story. Earlier this month, the Fresno Bee went through a round of layoffs. 3 longtime editors were let go by the Bee's parent company, McClatchy, and the local opinion pages will now be managed by the Sacramento Bee. These weren't the first layoffs for the storied newspaper. In fact, layoffs in the media industry are unfortunately becoming commonplace as ad revenue shrinks and fewer people are willing to pay for their news. But these layoffs hit close to home for Jim Boren. He's the executive director of Fresno State's Institute for Media and Public Trust. Before that, he served as the Fresno Bee's executive editor. After these recent layoffs, he took to Substack to write a cautionary piece he titled "The Day the Opinion Pages Died in Fresno." He sat down with KVPR associate editor Carrie Klein to talk about the state of local news in the Valley and why the opinion pages in particular matter.
Well, I come from this discussion as a former opinion page editor at the Fresno Bee, and we had op-eds from experts. We had a vibrant Letters to the Editor page. We had editorials that often set the tone of public policy in the San Joaquin Valley. So I saw what the editorial pages could be, and I also thought that it's really important for a local news site to have a really direct connection with news consumers. And the editorial page is very direct, whether through Letters to the Editor, op-eds, or other kinds of things. And when they cut that off, I thought it was really problematic for a local news site to tout being local without having local opinion and commentary.
So you were the editor of the Fresno Bee between 2012 and 2018. Tell us a little bit more about what is the mission of editorial pages and why are they important?
Well, they're important because, one, the editorials are the institutional voice of the newspaper. So when the Fresno Bee has an opinion or they endorse a candidate, that's the collective voice of the institution as judged by the editorial board, which are the editorial page staff and the publisher and often the executive editor. In addition to that, the editorial page also has an op-ed page, which originally was called, because it was opposite the editorial page, that's what the term op-ed came from.
I didn't know that.
And then we also had Letters to the Editor. We would get hundreds of letters to the editor every year. In fact, the Measure Z zoo tax came from a letter of the editor from a 9-year-old girl who wrote a letter on Thanksgiving Day about her wish to save the zoo in Fresno that was really deteriorating then. And she put $1 into that letter and said, "I'm going to give $1. I hope everybody else was." We raised something like $750,000 that came through the Bee through donations from across the country. And then ultimately it led to the Measure Z tax, which several $1 million annually that it's generated through that sales tax.
Wow.
So that's the power of just Letters to the Editor.
Right. And I think that an important distinction here is that the opinion pages at the Fresno Bee will not actually be going away, but they will now be managed in Sacramento by editors at the Sacramento Bee. And you actually wrote in your Substack, Fresno's editorial voice will now be spoken from 180 miles away. Yeah.
These are great journalists in Sacramento, but they can't pay attention to all the issues in Sacramento and also look over their shoulder as what's going on in Fresno. So I think it weakens the community's voice overall.
Now, one of the other people laid off last week was Juan Esparza Loera, who for decades was editor of Vida en el Valle. That's the Spanish language sister publication of the Fresno Bee. This leaves only one reporter left at Vida. Could you give me a sense of the history of this publication and its effort to reach Spanish-speaking audiences?
Well, this was a really visionary section that Juan helped found many, many years ago, and it looked into our Spanish-speaking community and wrote stories both in English and in Spanish. And it was an opportunity to reach beyond our normal English-speaking customers. And they did a great job over the years, and a lot of really powerful journalism came out of that. So anytime you have a local news site and you take away local resources, it can't get better. It can only get worse.
Now, you are currently the executive director of Fresno State's Institute for Media and Public Trust. It feels like trust is not all that healthy right now when it comes to journalism and media. Can you talk a little bit more about where public trust is?
Yeah, it's not good. In fact, that's one of the reasons that when we established the Institute for Media and Public Trust in 2018 was to try to deal with those trust issues, try to bridge that gap between news sites and news consumers, and try to be that middle person in between to explain how newsrooms work, and also give a voice to critics of news sites. And beyond that, we spent a lot of time on the First Amendment and trying to show readers and others how important news sites are to protecting our basic freedoms, the 5 freedoms that are in the First Amendment. That said, I'm buoyed by the number of local news sites that are trying to fill that gap, whether it's the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative and Fresno Land and GV Wire, and there's others. In the old days, the Fresno Bee was so vibrant because we were the only ones that owned a $45 million printing press. Now we carry that printing press in our pocket in the form of our smartphones. So anybody can start a news site. And I think that it's democratized, news gathering. In fact, the Substack column that's generated a lot of interest on this subject is something that I wrote in Substack. I didn't need a big corporation behind me to do that.
Well, that gives me hope that with your institutional knowledge of journalism, that you can be nostalgic for the past, but also optimistic for the future. But I want to talk about our listeners, viewers, readers. What can they do to be a part of the solution?
Well, the first thing I always tell folks when I give speeches, be part of the solution by paying for the journalism you consume. It's not easy, and it's not cheap to put reporters on the street. And the way the internet has changed things, big tech is taking all those advertising dollars that once funded journalists in Fresno and in other places, and we have to do it some way. And so there's, philanthropy, and I know that the public broadcasting stations have their challenges now because of things that have happened in Washington. The other thing is be a good news consumer by consuming a lot of different media outlets. So if you think that one is liberal and one is conservative and one doesn't cover things very well, don't just go to one news site, go to many of them.
So when your students ask you for career advice, what sort of career options are out there? How are they going to make money? What do you tell them?
Journalism. And we place almost every one of our students. I think we do everyone, but I would have to check actually. But almost everyone gets a job in journalism. Now, they may not work at the Fresno Bee where I work for 48 years and had a long career, and they're might bounce around to various jobs. But if you want to be involved in journalism, there are plenty of opportunities. In addition, you can be what some call a backpack journalist, where you can take video and do podcasts and others and make money on Substack and through some of the other places and be that self-contained. So there's all sorts of opportunity.
Jim Boren, Executive Director of the Institute for Media and Public Trust at Fresno State and former Executive Editor of the Fresno Bee, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you for having me.
Jim Boren was speaking with KVPR Associate Editor Carrie Klein. And that's today's show. Today's episode was produced by Carrie Klein, Crescencio Rodriguez Delgado, and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Sarith Hawk. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
Sources and methods, the crown jewels of the intelligence community. Shorthand for how do we know what's real? Who told us? If you have those answers, you're on the inside, and NPR wants to bring you there. From the Pentagon to the State Department to spy agencies, listen to understand what's really happening and what it means for you. Sources and Methods, the new national security podcast from NPR.